Okay, well, introducing myself. Let's see. I just recently retired from the Wiliamsburg Foundation, where when I left, I was Senior Curator of Environmental Collections. And so I don't know how much I know many of you in the audience. I am Murray Bowen's second daughter of 4 children. I have been involved in the archive project shortly before the time of his death in 1990. And so I'd like to just sort of introduce myself and say that my interest in archiving is long-standing. It's been a passion of mine from the time I was an undergraduate in college. And so, and I'm bringing these skills and this background to the Murray Bowen Archive Project. And so very few of you know about my background, so I thought I would give a short description of some of it as a way to give you a sense of how I see the project developing. And so that is part of the talk tonight. So I am going to leave it and let you all discover as I work. And I tried to, and it was actually quite fun to start talking about my past and to start thinking about it. So I tried to keep it as brief as I could. So hang in there with me, and I am hoping to leave ample time for questions afterwards, because I know you will have many, many questions. So, so I'm going to start and say, shortly before Murray Bowen's death, he asked me to ensure his archives would be secure for the future, housed at the National Library of Medicine, where they would be preserved and available to the world, important to the world, sort of open to the public as well. And I asked what he wanted to go, and he swept his hand across the room. And in doing so, passed on to me the responsibility to make choices. And so since this time, I've dedicated myself to giving his archives in the most responsible way I know how, in a way that will secure the breadth of his archives for the ages, and in a manner that will enable the digital access and search engine to researchers and the interested public. And I also would like to say that throughout this effort, my siblings and extended family have been stalwart supporters, each believing in the importance of his papers and wanting them to be preserved. And so there have been many steps along the way. Leroy Bowen transferred 146 boxes of professional records, but she held aside his family papers and photographs for me to continue where she left off. In 2011, when my siblings, our spouses, and I cleaned out our home, we discovered in the attic documents dating from when Murray Bowen was in college until he moved to Bethesda in the 1950s. What a treasure trove. And these materials are now stored in a climate-controlled facility near my home. So in 1989, Andrea Scher and Priscilla Friesen responded to Murray Bowen's request that they assist with his AV records, and they transferred an important group of clinical videos to NLM. In 1990, the Bowen family transferred all video recordings in the home to the Bowen Center, where they could serve as a resource for teaching and research. In 2007, the Bowen Center agreed to transfer the bulk of these records to NLM, where they are now in cold storage. And so altogether, these materials represent one of the largest collections of its kind, both in quantity and in their breadth and depth. And the library considers this collection unique for several reasons. One, Bowen was a pioneer in the field in the use of AV equipment, and also because he wrote thousands of letters. He saved copies of the letters he wrote, and he saved the copies he received, allowing the rare opportunity to see the exchange between Bowen family, professionals, friends, and so forth. And so whoops, no, I'm going to go back. So as an archaeologist and historian, I've learned the principles of managing, curating, and researching collections, and the most important of which is to preserve the entirety of the collection. I've been at archiving for 48 years, hard to believe, beginning as a college senior and going through a 34-year career as an historical archaeologist. And so I'm going to say briefly now, my senior and master's thesis, dissertation, and subsequent work all taught me system-based research depends upon the careful curation of all categories of information. Archaeology also taught me excavation is an act of destruction. So we save everything, more than what interests us, and we use metadata systems to record three-dimensional locations to provide provenience information needed for analysis and future researchers who will have new questions. So this is my perspective, that the Murray Bowen's archives deserve the same care. They are phenomenal. Each category, each type of video record, and his written record portrays a part of his history, a part of his life. If only a select number of categories are preserved, history will know Murray Bowen's thinking only through what survives. Murray Bowen's professional and family lives both contributed to the development of his theory. Throughout his psychiatric career, he lived with tension in the medical world. Physicians did not treat their own family members, yet Bowen challenged the very foundation of the doctor-patient relationship. In his private world, he observed behavior anytime, anywhere, and everywhere. I'm sure every one of you experienced this. His records reflect his commingled world, where everyone in every research laboratory was a scientific subject to be observed. Murray Bowen may have collected fees from clients, but his door was open, free of charge, to family, neighbor, colleague, friend, and student, each of whom received the same attention he gave his clients. So following Murray Bowen's model, non-paying subjects are functionally indistinguishable from his clients. In his nuclear family's world, his wife and children lived the evolution, learning the concepts before they had a name. In his professional worlds, he observed his colleagues, clients, and students, who each individually and collectively learned in a different way. So the challenge ahead is to develop a system that respects the fact that Bowen did not compartmentalize his world. The archive system should be organized in a way that researchers and the public can grasp how Bowen was able to move seamlessly between his professional and private worlds, able to differentiate and integrate what he observed. So this is my perspective. The future depends on those of us who do understand and who knew him to attempt an archive system that will provide a roadmap that lays out how Murray Bowen's laboratories were distinct yet commingled. In thinking about this challenge, I've drawn on my research background, where I integrated data from multiple databases to begin conceiving of a system where researchers would be able to see how his commingled world permitted him to see and describe the biological basis of human functioning. This is no small task, but if the Murray Bowen Archive project succeeds, Murray Bowen's archives at NLM and an online catalog that we hope to have will become a model for how medical archives such as Bowen's can be open to the public when the subjects are still living. Let me begin with my background that has been the inspiration. During my junior year at Beloit College, I worked for 8 months at the Laboratory of Anthropology in the Museum of New Mexico in Santa Fe. This was my field term, and during the summer I assisted with the excavation of a 17th century hacienda. And the project became my senior thesis and my first effort to integrate multiple databases. The site was located on the west side of the Rio Grande River, which is over here, and Bernalillo, the town, was on the east side. But my advisor believed otherwise, that the town was at one point on the west side. He gave me a package of transcribed land records and with the question, was the town at some point on the west side? And archaeological evidence made it clear someone had lived on the west side. I dug in it for a whole summer. And so what did the documents say? I wrestled with the land records that describe the land in relation to the river. And guess what? A major flood had shifted the river and with it, the town. So this was my first lesson in how independent and contemporary databases can inform the other. And the town's history emerged only through the ultimate integration of multiple lines of evidence. In 1972, I entered the PhD anthropology program at Brown University. And my advisor was Dr. James Deetz, who you see here. He was the leading theoretician in historical archaeology. He was unique, charismatic, much like Murray Bowen. He was a pioneer who broke ranks with his prehistoric colleagues and taught his students documentary sources were as important as archaeology. And so my master's thesis was part of this multidisciplinary project. Dr. Deetz had been contacted by the local historical historians who were studying this farmhouse that you see here. It had been owned by the Mott family from 1639 to 1895 when another family purchased it. At some point, it became a tenement for Portuguese immigrants. Do you all know how rare this is and what an opportunity it was? And so here, somebody went in and went through the land grants, and this is the drawing of the ownership as it passed through the generations. And the fact that the original property remained largely intact, together with the house, showed the land was a rich canvas of the Mott family's continuity with its succeeding generations and the land that sustained them. The project's goal was to reconstruct the history of the house through archaeology, documents, and oral history, to interpret the archaeological deposits in light, and this is important for the Bowen group, in light of the expansion and contraction of the home as one generation succeeded another. He took us to the site, and we could sense the history as the architectural historians led us through the house, pointing out features like this rafter that its roof was once here. And it was a relic of the former generation still standing. They described a shoe and a dead cat they found in a wall. We entered a room where they had pulled up the floorboards, and I could see rat nests containing trash, mostly shiny, some new, some old. Dr. Deetz talked about where we might find refuse buried under and around the house. And I can tell you, walking through this, all the students and I, we could sense the generation's presence all around and observe the physical manifestations of the multi-generational process. The forces of individuality and togetherness that surfaced during the transition from one generation to the next. I was becoming a zooarchaeologist, a specialist who studies animal bones, and Dr. Deetz observed my reaction to the house, and he pulled me aside and told me not to lose heart, as he believed bones were important. But he didn't have to worry. I was so focused on what bones had to say about the agrarian lives of this family, and specifically the social and economic matrices in which their nuclear and extended families raised and farmed animals, or raised animals. So during the summer, a fellow student took me into the courthouse and showed me how to conduct primary research. And later I identified these animals, what the different species are. And it was my task to integrate the two. So let me try to be really brief. Experience with the archaeological and documentary data has taught me two things. One, published historical interpretations almost never agree with archaeological data. Okay, and archaeological and primary documentary data don't agree with each other either. What do you do? So what's going on? Well, one, it's been my understanding, and that has come through a long period, that everybody's perceptions are based on cultural beliefs, theories, and they bring these beliefs to interpretations of the past. And published histories interpret their documents in light of the beliefs. And two, archaeological data and historic data represent contemporary but independent representations of the past. My dad observed when he came into the laboratory of anthropology, he looked around in New Mexico, and he looked around and he said, "There's some science in this." And I went, phew. Anyway, so the challenge in creativity comes in evaluating current historical interpretations in light of different anthropological and scientific theories, and then you evaluate each data set in its own terms, and the end result will be facts that neither could produce on their own. And so in all this, I have come to understand any resolution of discrepancies requires careful thought and openness to incorporate new information. I ask myself, are discrepancies the result of biased interpretations of historical or archaeological evidence, or are the different data sets providing different perspectives on past events? I can tell you resolving these issues is never easy. So at the time, there were two interpretations of colonial life. One portrayed New England to be a region where Puritans had come with their families to create a new life for themselves. And so beginning in Plymouth and then continuing through the region, they established communities where every household was self-sufficient, meaning they produced a range of crops and livestock for consumption. The second interpretation portrayed these farmers as businessmen intent on producing a commodity, such as horses or cattle. The debate was heated. One side convinced New England towns were tightly knit communities. The other side depicted farmers as profit-driven and not reliant on social relationship. My thesis focused on this problem. Was Jacob Mott a self-sufficient farmer, or did he focus on producing a commodity? My first step was to learn more about agrarian economies by reading ethnographies. And Robert Redfield, who wrote one of the classics of a town in Mexico, showed farmers raised foods for their own consumption, and that their labor, like all self-sufficient farmers, was based on community-wide, ego-centered exchange groups, that there was a social and emotional safety net as well as labor. And he also demonstrated that in addition to producing foods for consumption, these farmers also produced a surplus that they used to pay taxes. So it immediately became evident that the historical debate was a red herring. And I wondered, why don't the historians read some anthropology? And so, but on another level, it shifted my thinking from the either or to a more nuanced approach. And drawing on this knowledge, I tried to put Jacob Mott and his family into the agrarian society in which he and his family lived. Did they raise feed livestock for themselves or for the growing market? Did they have exchange relationships with their kin? So these two databases, so I drew on the archaeology and the primary documentary evidence for an answer. So the excavation produced what we call a large assemblage of faunal remains that dated to the 1730s, and they were the remains of past meals. So they represented what the Motts consumed. I also had an probate inventory of items owned by him at the time of his death, and they represented the live animals. And then I compared them, and here's only one graph I'm going to show you. And so the left are the numbers of individuals represented in the bones, and here it is in the probate inventories. And note the difference. And and so what this is showing is that they consumed most of the pigs that they had and the cattle, but look at the sheep. So I went back and did some research in the economic histories. And guess what? They were selling sheep to the West Indies. So here, he was raising a something to sell. And so, but was he a subsistence or a commercial farmer? This is a darn good question. And you know, where is it in the nuances of how rural families live their lives and how they shift from one focus to another? And so, who was Jacob Mott and his family? And so I had only one piece of historical evidence that suggests that Jacob engaged in reciprocal exchanges. In his inventory, he owned half a horse.
Or did you find the other half?
I said, who owned the other half? And so I needed more data, and I was stuck. So my dissertation came out of this, and I was interning at Old Sturbridge Village. Have any of you visited there? It's a beautiful place. And one day a colleague took me to the Connecticut Historical Society to see some farm account books. I was blown away. I saw hundreds and thousands of entries, including butchering, threshing, plowing, preparing, name, hoes, you name it, along with meat, butter, cheese, wheat, corn, potatoes. What a treasure trove. At the time, historians focused on the items and to say when wheat was introduced or whatever. But I saw something that excited me even more. I realized that my colleague had handed me a gift that would allow me to explore the filial interconnectedness of the agrarian world. So my problem became to define reciprocal exchange networks, and it gave me an opportunity to become an historic ethnographer, an anthropologist whose informants were documentary records. And my success depended on finding a sufficient number of accounts from one town that would allow me to reconstruct the networks of multiple farmers. I surveyed upwards of 50 towns, going in basements, courthouses, historical societies, and ultimately I found 200 account books from Suffield. And I can be pretty stubborn, and some people patted me on the head and said, now, dear, you'll never find that. I thought, you know, challenge me again. Anyway, so the next is, how did I reconstruct the agrarian system of food production? And what did I learn from the synthesis that I would not otherwise have known? And so the account books, here, I'll go back, became the foundation. Each account book recorded the individuals with whom they engaged and who worked with them. So I was able to capture that this was a relationship and what they exchanged amongst themselves. So I was able to have the guts of it. But I had to define the kin relationships, and this took forever. Land records, like here, showed the locations, who owned the property and who purchased the property. There were church records. And the sample size was so large, I had to narrow the scope. So I narrowed it to 2 extended families spanning 5 generations. Do you know how rare this is for historical studies to find this and what it took to do this? And out of all these, I had 2,000 individuals that I had to do their family reconstructions. So I had to narrow it even more. And so I focused it into the 18th century. And since I studied animals, I selected only those people who recorded anything related to animals. And so, oops, I'm going the wrong way. So the sample dropped to 6 account books and 400 individuals. It still took months to figure out who was related to whom. And here's a map that of the farms and where they are located, and these dots represent them. And fortunately, there was a woman named Delphina Hammer Clark, who was the first female graduate from the Yale Architecture School, and she'd married a local man. And she spent 30 years going through these records. She took the records home at night. of who lived where, who built what house, and as she did so, she left genealogies and maps. And this is what allowed me to create this study. And I found two families. The Sykes live over here on the east side, and the Sheldons live over here. And what I learned that these exchange networks were so tight that there was only one that overlapped. You could literally walk. And so they are, as the anthropologists described, they're really tight agrarian networks. So if you can think of the connectedness of the families to each other and to the land, that you just become steeped in the relation of this very important relationship. And so this was really rich data, and I pulled all the animal-related entries out, and I'm not going to show you because that would take forever to explain. And I saw that everybody was exchanging amongst themselves, and I went, darn, we have a homogeneous, tightly knit community where people are self-sufficient, and they exchange with each other for the purpose of obtaining labor and reinforcing their relationships. I kind of bought into that. However, I hadn't completed an additional step to reconstruct the economic structure of the community. And so I went back to a 1780 tax record that gave the evaluations of who owned what, a house, land, and livestock. And so that enabled me to say which families could produce and which didn't have the resources to produce. Statistics count, I can tell you. It completely changed my interpretation. And what I was able to see that there were 4 demographic groups. The poorest were made up 35% of the households. They didn't own a house. They didn't own any land. They may have had a horse, pig, or a cow, but there's no way they could produce food. The wealthiest were right over here, 5%. And they had enough to produce for themselves. And so that allowed me to go back into my data and completely restructure a nuance of putting it as the society was not homogeneous, it was stratified. And so I redefined self-sufficiency on a community level. So for me, I can't tell you how much time it took me to do this, but I began to learn. After I had gone through this, I could pull up these account books and say, he's a laborer. I began to see that, I was able to capture the moment when these farmers shifted from self-sufficient to commercial. I was able to see the change in the diet, towards a more restricted. And so laying this immense groundwork of what I call an historic ethnography is you can begin to start drawing understandings and generalizations that if you remain focused using one database or another, you won't get there. And so that's my vision and for the archives. And laying it out specifically, we have to get in and wrestle with it. And so for me, the approach demands clear historiography, an evaluation of each area, home, office, I'm calling it his laboratory, and a rigorous attention to the different periods of his life. So I'm gonna, I missed one of these. This is, sort of get you the sense of the flavor of families working with each other and their neighbors to complete a job. So I'm going to move on really quickly. I'm going to go through the different categories of information and records that we have. And so one, you all know these. They're the 2 that you all read. There's the new one that came out of Jack Butler, who pulled papers from the National Library of Medicine. Then there is the 4th of Clarence Boyd, who pulled letters from the library. And they all have some really important information to work with. And for me, as an historian and historiographer, I think of these in the same category as archives because they provide a view or perspective of the past. And in addition, there are early publications dating from the time he was in the Miniker Foundation. And there are presentations in draft and final form. There are clinical records, and that date from the 1940s to 1990. And the earliest clinical records remain at the Miniker archives. But there are a number of copies of these in the NLM collection, and there are also some in Wiliamsburg. And they also include correspondence he had with the clients. He kept both. Taken together, they record how his clinical techniques evolved as his theory evolved. I spent one day in the records going through them. And I tell you, those early records, you could see the communication from the clients and how they were trying, and he was walking his way out of psychoanalytic thought. And you could see the communications from the patient saying, you need to be looking at this. And so, to me, there are many rich resources to see what it takes for an original thinker to walk his way out of a way of thinking. And these records, taken individually and in their totality, will allow people to do this. And so his, and I want you to know that as he got into his records, this may take more, take more time, he kept very scant notes as he got into it. He would hire his children to file his clinical notes. And there would be on the top of the page, Mrs. A or Mrs. P, and the date and the time, and then usually a blank page. Or just a few. Or late again today, he kept a record of how many minutes they were late. And, but, you know, go back to his early records, and you can see how he walked his way out of it. I don't think it was an easy walk. I know it was a tough walk. There are his papers. Then here's Catherine Rocco here. She did the work here. And they include the clinical notes, the manuscripts, the administrative reports, a whole range of things. There are the post-NIMH clinical records at NLM. And then moving on, here is professional correspondence is expansive. And it includes with some of the pioneers. It includes a whole range of people. And like the others, they give a window to the emergence of the field as a whole and the role he played in the development. And they also include, and I've circled this because this is important, personal information about the individual, in addition to his thinking about how emotional processes work and don't work. The principles that grew out of his work and the science of observing human behavior. They are in these letters, all commingled with personal information. And we'll talk about that more later. Then there's the AV records that you all know so well. They include the NIMH meetings, the family center presentations, clinical conferences, tapes with two families, videos with well-known therapists and lectures. He was a pioneer in technology and the first to use closed-circuit television in family therapy. And this is an image of him receiving an award for his work at the Medical College of Virginia. So those who've listened to these tapes are in awe. He comes alive, thinking on his feet, exploring ideas and challenging the status quo in contemporary psychiatry. There are his medical records. He's got the class notes from medical school with detailed illustrations. They're his slides. Open up a box of slides, and there was one for anthrax. We close that thing right back up. And these are all in the boxes. They're textbooks in his library that he kept on his bookshelves his entire life. And I suggested to one person, if you wanted to know where he got the term differentiation, go to those textbooks. That's where he got the biological foundations on which he built his theory. So there are his army records. So Murray Bowen, his wife, often remarked that Murray would have been good at anything he attempted. I agree. Included in this collection are administration papers he kept while stationed at Fort Bragg. And based on my mother's knowledge and these records, I know he was superb. Also included are letters to and from Army colleagues, and they illustrate the long-time friendships he had with doctors who served alongside him during the war. And then there are the family papers, and I've broken them out in a slightly different way than we have introduced them before. And so there's a whole series of things that come out during the period when he was in college, medical school, and internships, 1930s and 40s. And so Bowen didn't save copies of his correspondence to family members, but he did save the letters he received from his parents and siblings. And together, it's a wonderful story of, before email and telephones, of siblings leaving home and establishing their lives. It's sort of a beautiful story. There are many letters from World War II, some in V-mail form, and they include observations about war and the soldiers' challenges. And they document the time in which he decided to become a psychiatrist. Then there are family letters that date from 1946, when he began writing letters addressed sometimes to all, some at times to a number, and sometimes a single individual. And his goal was to maintain contact, to inform others about notable events in his family. And they include observations about meetings, people he knew, the environment, societal issues, firsthand descriptions that when he would come back from meetings, to catch it in the moment. His writing is so down to earth. It's often poetic and profound. There are a series of letters that he wrote to his extended family during the first year at Miniger's. They're really wonderful. And for you all to know is that as each child left home, Bowen included them in his circle of recipients. So we all got them. And he would say, maybe people would read them, maybe they wouldn't. And sometimes we say, oh, here's another one, and put it down. But they were there for us to, and so taken together, these letters provide yet another perspective on his professional world, and showing how he conducted research and how he lived his life. So then there's the family history. He did extensive work on his own family. You all may remember, his encouragement to get you to go back and study your own family. He did it, and there are 2 or 3 Hollinger boxes of materials that he produced. He traced back his family to Moses Bowen, who came from Wales in 1699, and the Luff family that emigrated from England in 1812. And this took a huge amount of effort, and he did it in a way that he established relationships with descendants to start making links. He went to cemeteries. He went to family, people he never met before, and he maintained and developed strong relationships with the goal that this is a book ready to be written on family history, looking at the multi-generational emotional process as seen through the lens of the generations of his own family. And so then there are photographs, and there are about 6 boxes of these, and they include professional and hundreds upon hundreds of family pictures. So, moving ahead, and taken together, these documents lay the foundation for a deeper understanding of how Bowen's concepts emerged out of his early professional and personal experiences. They show, in their different worlds, the emergence and growth of his theory, starting from the time when he was a college student to the last years of his life when he worked to integrate his concepts into a science of human behavior. to understand the whole Murray Bowen, the man who redefines the psychiatric model, each and every laboratory must be evaluated in its own terms. We all know he could move seamlessly between his worlds, able to integrate and differentiate between his worlds. How did he do it? Where and how did the cornerstone of his theory, differentiation, emerge? When and how did he develop the theoretical tenet that the clinician worked first on self? How did his clinical work inform his functioning in his own nuclear and extended families, and vice versa? I don't know the answers to these questions, but I do have a really deep conviction that NLM and the Archive Project should adopt a similar approach and work to explore an archive system that allows users to observe each of his worlds in their own terms. And so what will it take to open the collection to the world? The medical model NLM follows doesn't work for the Bowen collection. Why? At NLM, where they work with medical collections, they generally receive only professional papers, research, data, client records, and these collections are open only to researchers who submit a research proposal, and users are required to follow their protected health information policy, where all information leading to the identification of an individual's identity must be redacted. Collections are open to the public only after all PHI information is redacted or when the patients are no longer living. So I will say this has been a learning exercise for everyone involved. NLM and the Murray Bowen Archives Project have been working with the medical model, not fully comprehending the extent to which Murray Bowen's personal worlds are intermixed in the professional files. We haven't recognized the fact that his non-paying subjects are functionally indistinguishable from his clients, and they deserve the same protection the medical model provides his clients. The challenge is to respect records and that reflect his commingled world. So the Archive Project is hoping to build an online catalog, a system that will release important information to the world, and our website would be the vehicle for this happening. And so as the questions and challenges about what can go up and what needs to be protected and all, there's been a lot of debate, a lot of, about this. And so our effort has become just that much more complicated. How do you protect the information and release the theoretically important information? There was a lot of, head banging going on. And finally, my husband said, rather than focus on what you had to redact, why don't we just focus on what can go? What is really important is the observations that have theoretical importance. And I said, what a relief. It was like this huge weight had come off my head. And so looking at collections such as this one, like Charles Darwin's family, Sigmund Freud's family, they have had these huge collections with a lot of personal information. Darwin's family closed theirs for 150 years. Freud's family opened their collection only recently. And I did a little bit of research on the web and discovered that it was 2 years after the death of the last living grandchild. So, and so the younger grandchildren around 30. So this is what we're looking at. And so I want you all to know that the Bowen family is ready to lead the way to finding a way to open Murray Bowen's amazing collection to the world. And we are ready to release the theoretically important information contained in our family letters. And so I'm confident this will work. And if we succeed, NLM, with the Bowen families and the Archive Project's support, with their support, we will have developed a model for collections where individuals are still living. So I'm about towards the end, and I've been just steaming right along, so there's all sorts of time for questions. And so I thought, some people have pressed me for details on what's the advantage of this archival approach. What are you talking about? And, you know, people come from a clinical backgrounds, they're not historians, and they haven't conducted this type of research. And so I'll say that I'm convinced this approach has the best chance of creating an online catalog. And it is the only way, I think, to give the public access to Murray Bowen's records. It will also open up the records to the professionals sitting in their own home. It's expensive to go down to the library. Right now, you would have to commit a week or a month of your time going through boxes that are not fully organized. That's very difficult to access. And so I think this approach will create sort of a canvas of the entirety of the collection with a structure that will guide the selection of materials to go online. So there's another part of this question. Why are the archives important? And some people say, well, he died a long time ago. You know, what's in them? And so Bowen warned years ago about the erosion of his theory, the forces that would focus thinking inward and see the theory as fixed. He understood that in the process it would lose the breadth and depth of his work. His archives are in his own words, both spoken and written, and it's my belief that they're critical to the future of his theory. And I'm going to tell you a quick story that drove home my first year in graduate school in anthropology. It's a history of anthropology, and each of us were given the task of reading a secondary textbook about a great theoretician's work and reading the original. And at this point, I can't remember who I read, but I came away thinking, they're totally different. And so to me, having grown up with Murray Bowen, that was like a, you know, like a bomb going off. I thought, huh, okay. And so this is what I think the archives holds for the future of Bowen theory. It's sort of an open book. You can go back and see his ideas in his own words. And he published relatively little. But I can tell you, he was up most nights typing until 2 or 3 in the morning. He would sleep for 2 or 3 hours and start seeing having appointments at 7 and 8 in the morning. This is what he did with 2 fingers, really fast. And so there are thousands and thousands of these letters. And so I thought it might be kind of fun to think about 2 things that have come to mind for me. One, because an area I've been working in, and also, you know, as people start talking about Murray Bowen and who he was, I'd say, how did Murray Bowen see himself? And how do people describe who he was? You hear doctor, psychiatrist, coach, therapist, biologist, naturalist, scientist, researcher, ethologist, and healer. You know, they're all out there. And so people, of course, will go back into their documents and read them through their own filters. But I think the archival approach has a better chance of trying to reconstruct how Bowen saw himself. And as an historian, I would say Murray Bowen saw himself a certain way when he was talking to you. What did he see himself as when he was a college student? And how would he have described himself over the decades? And the way you see yourself and how your work and how you function is that he may have been a lot of these. You know, he was a physician, and yet his work did a lot to help people with their own lives. So when people say a healer, you know, that was one of the functions. But I don't know that he saw himself this way. And I thought, okay, when he was saying he was not doing therapy, you all heard this many times. Was he making a point to get others to sort of focus on the broader perspective? I don't know. Do you take that literally? These are all open-ended questions. So I'd go back and look at all these laboratories chronologically. And I might, find passages. And one that comes to mind is, have you all heard the story of when he was working with his family and they had a funeral home and they had the hearse and they were also the ambulance service that took people, sick people to Nashville hospital, the hospital in Nashville. And he told the story of a young girl that came down ill and he went in the ambulance with her to the hospital. And he observed the physicians didn't know what to do, and he watched her die within 24 hours. The story I remember is that he was focused on the physicians, not the girl who was dying. And so you go back to these stories, and how do your filters see this story? Do you see it, in light of looking at Murray Bowen analytically? I know he came away saying he vowed he wanted to make a difference and to help solve the problem. The focus was not on the girl near death, but on the system that was unable to solve this situation. And so is this an act of an observer, healer, researcher? I don't know. Anyway, so all this discussion, because I've been very clear, he was focused on the physicians. And I thought, this is a man who was capable of focusing on the system when the anxiety was on the girl. And he was able to study the system. There is, when he was a young man, the capacity to focus on the system. And, I said, so how did he come out with the idea of being a coach in the clinical? This is another way of thinking. If you go back to that image in the emergency room of what it is to stand above the anxiety and to observe. Anyway, so I think a lot of these stories are in these records, and that you will be able to see him, and and you will find any question that you have. You can start taking some ideas and going back and thinking about where he got the ideas, and it may give you another appreciation about how he got where to go and what it will take for you to go to walk the walk that he walked. So there are payoffs in many different ways. And the last thing I wanted to sort of bring up was his concept of societal regression, that I have come to think of as societal emotional process. And I know that this is being talked about, regression, or, and so I would take this concept and think about the time he was developing it, in the 60s and the 70s. And I would look around, and there was the Vietnam, there was the protests, there was loosening of the social mores, and it went on and on and on. And so there was the assassinations. So there was a lot of turmoil. And so this is my take, that he began to understand, I think, a brilliant contribution, that stressed societies function like stressed families. It's a brilliant contribution. And he would talk about regression. That's what he was seeing. And yet he would say, there is more to this. He had several conversations with me. you know, that he wanted his theory to grow and expand. And he would say that others knew far more than he, and that he did not have the life left in him to tackle it any further. What was he thinking? And so he would say, in sort of an offhand way, societies function and go up like families, and they go down. So you're talking about a process. And so I think he left that as sort of an open-ended, hoping other people would take it. And so I think, you know, I was standing right here giving in a workshop, and afterwards I was saying, you know, a lot of his ideas he developed until the end of his life. The last publication, there was a short publication shortly before his death, and most people are referencing the book in 1978. But after his surgery in, 1981, he was unable to write in the way that he was able to do before, and he shifted to being videotaped. And so I said, I'd like to know what's in there. You know, so he shifted the way he recorded his thoughts to the verbal, and he kept pecking away. And they didn't come out except in the compilation that you see in the family evaluation. So if you understand sort of the history and where he was with his health and what he was able to do, that his brain didn't stop in 1978. You all had, many of you had the benefit of working with him. But heck, he was at home writing the whole time. And it's down there in the library, and there's still quite a few papers in the Wiliamsburg storage unit where I took them after we cleaned out the home. So anyway, I think that we have a lot of work to open them up to the world. But I just wanted to give you sort of a glimpse of the way I'm thinking about how to open them up in a way that the world will be able to get access to them while we are still living. So, thank you.